Hey you! Yes, you, watching this video. Do you want to own a piece of Scribbler? Only not a lock of hair or blood or flesh or anything else that will get you in trouble with the law? Well, now you can, with t-shirts, hoodies, tote bags and mugs featuring Obab Scribbler at her Teespring store. You know you want to. I shall now stop talking in third person and send you on to the video. Be lovely to each other and enjoy the show. Cadence paused in the middle of the street and looked up. The sky was spinning chaos. Whatever the Cloudsdale Pegasi were trying, it wasn't working. Or were they attempting to clear the weather somewhere else? Restoring calm here wouldn't make rail travel any easier if the blizzard still raged along the whole path north from Canterlot. Turning left, Cadence stepped through the accumulating snow. The powder was still fresh everywhere she looked. It seemed that no pony was inclined to venture outside in this weather. No pony but her and the servant she had asked, or ordered, to join her. For the fourth time that night, she found herself distinctly aware of the fact that the cold no longer seemed to touch her as it used to. She remembered a tiny filly, lost in a forest of barren branches. That filly had been frozen to the bone.
That filly is gone.
The snow swirled into a dense mist, and for a moment the whole world went grey. Another memory washed over her. Her eyes hurt. She opened the book to the halfway point. The page said something about Starswell the Bearded's relationship with his apprentices. She ignored it, laying the letter inside the book where Twilight wouldn't be able to see it. Twilight came back into the room, wearing pink and purple pajamas. She crawled into bed with smarty pants and pulled the doll tight against her chest.
What story are you going to read?
Cadence tried to smile.
This one's about Clover the Clever. And how she lost her mother.
The snow blew past her, carrying the memory with it. Light shone in a few of the windows as she walked past, moving from street to street, not following any pattern. Occasionally, she could make out families of crystal ponies, sitting together, reading stories or playing games. She never drew close enough to see more than that. From time to time, she found her tracks crossing themselves, and sometimes the lights in the nearby windows changed, flickering out for the night, or moving from room to room within a house. She never saw any ponies singing, though. Eventually, her steps did indeed carry her to the train station. The building was still well lit. It would remain that way all through the night. She approached and, quietly, with one hoof, pulled open one of the heavy doors to the central chamber and slipped inside. Nothing had changed, really, since she'd been here last. The tall crystal clock read a few minutes past 10 now, but the station was as empty as it had been before. She couldn't see any of the uniformed agents anymore, but the grey mare with her cello case still slept against one of the walls, in the shadow of a tall crystal column. Cadence found herself staring at the mare. Dulcinea had never played the cello. She had laughed at the idea the one time her husband had suggested she try. The station agent's office was tucked into the northwestern corner of the building, and Cadence found the old stallion inside, sitting at a desk and filling out paperwork. He jumped a little when she knocked and entered.
Your Highness, I sent Jasper to the castle almost 20 minutes ago. Didn't he arrive? I thought you said I should have updates delivered to you there.
I did, Mr. Feldspar. I just
Cadence did her best to smile.
thought maybe I'd come check with you again this time. Is Jasper the same stallion you sent before?
Feldspar nodded.
He claimed he didn't want to go out in that cold again, but when I said I could send some pony else, he changed his mind real quick. Don't know why. I really shouldn't have asked him to do it twice. It's miserable out there.
And the weather, Mr. Feldspar?
Of course, Your Highness. Well, I've heard back from the Cloudsdale team. They say it's still pretty bad down south. They're making progress, but they don't know how soon they'll be done. I asked, but Rainbow Shine hemmed and hawed and wouldn't give me an estimate one way or the other.
Thank you, Mr. Feldspar. Would you please see to it that I continue to receive updates?
You sure about that, Your Highness? I mean, it's pretty late already. Whoever it is you're waiting for, you don't think it's more likely they'll just wait for tomorrow? If it gets a whole lot later, we may have to cancel tonight's train service anyway. Start up again with tomorrow's schedule.
She shook her head.
They'll come if they can. Please let me know if you hear anything further.
Feldspar nodded, and Cadence left him to his paperwork. She took one last look around the station, cheerless and empty despite the decorations. The grey mare was lying on her side. Cadence pushed her way out of the heavy station doors and ventured back into the storm. It had long since obscured the hoofprints of her earlier journey from the station to the castle, and her tracks leading back through the streets toward the orphanage were already filling with snow. When she reached the castle entrance, Cadence found the rail stallion, Jasper, waiting for her there. She let him deliver his message, thanked him, and told him to head back down to the kitchens once more before returning to the station. Then she headed up into the castle's interior, seeking out her bedroom. She lay on her bed for a few minutes. On the bed she shared with her husband. It still smelled like him. He'd only been gone for 2 nights. 3 nights, if he didn't make it back. Surely he'd be back tomorrow at least. She lay on the bed, but whatever she did, she couldn't make herself comfortable. So eventually she rose. She walked to the hearth, kept lit by the castle servants even while she was gone, as she'd been so often that night. Sap-filled maple hissed and popped at the heart of the flames, but the warmth of those flames didn't seem to reach her, much like the cold outside. Eventually, she grew bored with that as well. She pulled a chair away from her dressing table and turned it so she could sit, staring out at the snowfall. Maybe if she watched long enough, the snow would go away. A quiet knock came from the bedroom's open door. Cadence didn't turn, but after a moment, a set of hooves clicked across the crystal floor, moving toward her.
You should have seen them, Princess. They were so happy. Hardly even mattered that you weren't there. They knew it was all because of you, and most of them got to meet you anyway, even if it was only for a minute.
Cinnabar sat down on the floor, leaning back against the dressing table. It was, Cadence thought, a very improper thing for a servant to be doing in front of the new ruler of her kingdom. Cadence realized that she really didn't care.
Taught them that song and everything. I kind of figured you might want me to. I'll bet they stay up singing it for half the night. Larimar's gonna be mad at me all week.
That brought a small chuckle from Cadence, and she found herself smiling in spite of her mood.
Thank you. I wish I could have heard them.
Well, you can always go back later. Larimar loves those foals, and they love you. Every pony loves you, even if most of them don't know how to show it. Of course, you saved us from Sombra, but it's more than that. You're nice.
Cadence smiled reflexively, and for one beautiful moment, her heart didn't seem so heavy. It was hard to tell under that dark crimson coat, but Cadence thought Cinnabar might have blushed. She was certainly quick to change the subject.
Anyway, this Hearthswarming Eve thing. Why are you so fidgety about it? It's just another holiday.
Cadence turned back toward the window and the snow outside.
Not for me, Cinnabar. Is it okay if I call you Cinnabar?
You've been doing it already, Highness. And I don't mind. As long as the kitchen staff don't pick it up too.
Cadence heard the words, but not the answer.
I never knew who my parents were, Cinnabar. Maybe I'm an orphan too. I don't think any pony really knows, and my memory doesn't go back that far. The first thing I remember is being lost in a forest. It was winter. No snow, though, thanks, Celestia. I can remember being so cold. I didn't even know I was cold. I didn't remember ever not being cold. I was alone. And it was dark. And then some pony found me, a stallion. He was old, probably old enough to be a grandfather, but he and his wife never had any foals of their own. He took me home. He and his wife took care of me, fed me, and when no pony ever showed up to report a lost little filly, they became my mother and father. I don't know how old I was when all that happened. I hardly understood any of it at the time, though, so I must have been awfully little. I didn't understand birthdays or anything like that, either. No pony even knew when I was born, so Dulcinea, my mother, decided they ought to celebrate the night they found me like it was my birthday. And, as it happened, that night was Hearthswarming Eve.
So it's sort of like your birthday too?
Cadence continued to stare out the window.
My mother and father tried to make Hearthswarming special every year. They both loved music, and we'd sing songs, and they'd play their instruments together. My mother played the clarinet, and my father played the cello, and there was always hot apple cider with cinnamon and cloves, and the smell of it would fill our whole house. They made it wonderful, which was good, because as I got older, I started thinking more and more about what must have happened before they found me. Hearthswarming was lonely. And then one year, well, some years in your life, not much happens. Some years, a lot happens. I wound up getting sent to Canterlot so I could live with with Princess Celestia. It was the first Hearthswarming I'd ever spent away from my parents that year. And it was almost okay. I didn't really have anything to do. Alone in Canterlot on Hearthswarming, so I wound up full-sitting a little unicorn filly. And she had a brother, a really, really handsome brother, and they were both wonderful to me. They hardly knew me, but it felt maybe I didn't have to be alone on Hearthswarming. Like, maybe I'd be okay, even if I couldn't spend it with my parents.
She fell silent. Outside, the wind rattled against the shuttered glass panes, but it seemed to have died down a little. The fireplace crackled and popped behind her. Cadence stared forward, feeling the familiar hollowness this night always brought. Words never filled the empty space inside. She tried a long time ago. She told Celestia, that went without saying, and she told a little unicorn filly in the vain hope that sharing the pain might somehow make it less. She'd never told Shining, though. She needed to, she knew. She'd wanted to tell him tonight, tell him what Hearthswarming really meant to her. But he wasn't there. For the first time in 18 years, Cadence really was alone on Hearthswarming. Except for this little red mare she hardly knew. The words came anyway. They were all she had left.
I didn't spend a whole lot of time with them. Not that night. Aunt Celestia had invited me to pass the evening with her, so we could get to know each other better. I'd only been in Canterlot a few weeks, so I went back to the palace. I went up to my room to get ready, and there was a letter waiting for me on my bed. It was in my father's hoof writing. There was a big snowstorm, like this one. The Pegasi didn't know where it came from.
Her voice trailed off.
Pegasi are supposed to be able to fix the weather, right? I never learned how they did that. Maybe if I There was a snowstorm about a week before Hearthswarming. It covered the whole forest around hollow shades, and then the temperature dropped well below freezing. Dulcinea would have been almost 70 by then. She got caught out in it. She was in the forest, watching after the birds that didn't go south for the winter. She always loved birds. I guess once it got bad, she couldn't find her way home. Celiano said the cold must have just been too much for her at that age. He passed away a few years later. He didn't have a whole lot to hold on for. With her gone, and with me away in Canterlot most of the year, every year.
Cadence bowed her head, and her voice grew quieter.
I should have been there. I should have gone back more often, but I never knew what to say. I'm supposed to know how to fix things. How do you fix a broken heart?
She raised her head again, and her voice gained a note of intensity.
And do you know what I hate most of all? None of it even happened on Hearthswarming Eve, but that's how I always remember it. It's not my birthday. It's not even the day she died. Because of the snow, my father's letter took 4 days to reach me in Canterlot. Nothing important ever happens on Hearthswarming. It's just a stupid holiday. The same as all the other stupid holidays, and I don't know why anybody even cares. But it's supposed to make ponies happy.
Silence settled over the room. Cadence stared out at the snow, longing for the cold she no longer felt.
It made me happy.
Cinnabar said quietly.
It made a lot of ponies happy tonight.
When Cadence made no reply, she continued.
My brother... he's not easy to get along with. He never was. Not even when we were growing up. But having to work for Sombra didn't make him any better. Seems like he's always angry about something. I guess I can understand that with the things he's had to do and with the way other ponies treat him. But not tonight. Not after you left. No pony ever cares about those little colts and fillies, Princess. No pony but him. That's what he thinks anyway. I still don't think he's forgiven me for coming to work in the palace kitchens. Not that I had a whole lot of choice when Sombra was running things. What you did tonight meant a lot to him, Highness. Even if you did go chasing off like some wild Mustang. I don't know if any pony else is going to care about Hearthswarming Eve tomorrow, but those kids will. And so will Larimar. And so will I. It's been so many years since I've seen him happy like that. It felt like...
There was a pause.
It felt like all the bad years never happened. It felt like being a family again.
The fire crackled in the hearth. Neither of them knew what else to say. Cadence watched the shadows of the storm dance across the window panes. Another knock on the door broke the quiet of the room. Regretfully, Cadence turned away from the window. The rail stallion, Jasper, stood in the doorway holding a letter. His grey uniform still looked crisp and proper, despite all the time he'd spent out in the snow that night.
A message for you, Princess.
Cadence's horn glowed with a faint blue light, and the letter levitated to her, unfolding as it came. She read it aloud, dully.
Due to disruptions in weather production, all passenger service to and from the Crystal Empire has been cancelled. Service will resume tomorrow at 3 p.m., pending successful completion of weather repairs. Hoofrey Newcommon Equestrian Rail Chief Commissioner.
Cadence let the letter fall to the floor. She took a breath to steady herself, but her voice still came out flat.
Thank you, Mr. Jasper. Could you please relay my thanks to Mr. Feldspar the next time you see him as well? And feel free to stop by the kitchen again if you'd like before you leave.
Jasper hesitated, as if deciding whether to say something. Then, after a moment, his eyes dropped to the floor, and he gave her a very deep bow before retreating from the room. The room stayed silent for a full minute after he left. Even the fire seemed to sense the mood, burning low over the white, charcoaled surface of the remaining logs. Cadence floated in a river of exhaustion. Why did it even matter to her if she had to spend Hearthswarming Eve alone?
So, bad news then?
The small voice was an unwelcome intrusion.
Isn't it always?
Cinnabar didn't reply, though she stood and retrieved the letter so she could read it for herself. She was silent for a while, and then, perhaps thinking it the appropriate thing to do, she took the letter to the hearth and set it on top of the smouldering logs. Cadence watched as the parchment blackened and curled in the fire.
Cinnabar?
Yes, Highness?
Cadence continued to stare at the fire for a little while, even though the letter was already gone.
Do you like being a sous chef?
Cinnabar paused in turn, and the firelight danced around the room.
It's what I've done all my life. Ever since I left the orphanage, at least.
That's not an answer.
I know. I'm not sure I have a real one I can give you.
They were both silent a little longer, and then Cadence continued.
In Canterlot, Aunt Celestia has a whole army of ponies that help her run the kingdom. It's a lot of work, keeping track of everything.
Sombra seemed to manage,
Cinnabar said, a touch bitterly.
I'm not Sombra. I'm just a Pegasus that never learned to fly right.
Cadence took a deep breath.
What would you think about...
Her voice trailed off, and she turned to stare at the window.
What do I think about what, Highness?
Quiet!
Cadence hissed. There it was again.
Did you hear that?
Cinnabar cocked her head, and the room grew very still. Then her eyes opened wide, and she turned to the window too.
But that doesn't make any sense.
I don't care if it makes sense!
Cadence rose from the chair and rushed to her study, where a balcony looked out over the city, facing the train station. She threw open the glass doors and stepped out into the storm, which still raged throughout the city. Down below, she could just make out the train station, and a tiny pink cloud of steam rising from an engine that she knew hadn't been there earlier in the evening. Her heart skipped a beat, and she looked around in a panic. She had to know if it was them, if somehow they'd found a way to get through the storm. Cinnabar hurried out onto the balcony.
Princess, can you see anything?
She raised a hoof to shield her eyes from the wind, scanning the sky. Cadence turned to the other mare and gave her a smile.
Cinnabar, would you please see if any of the servants are still awake, and let them know I may yet have guests coming tonight. I'll meet you down in the entryway in a few minutes.
What do you mean, you'll...
Cadence didn't hear the rest. She ran toward the edge of the balcony, spread her wings, and leapt over the guardrail. The wind caught her immediately, pressing her down, and it took all her skill to stay aloft. She kept her eyes on the station, banking left against the wind, then banking right, then left again. The air currents refused to settle into any single direction, and the rush of snow around her made it difficult to see. But all she had to do was glide and fall, all the way to the train station, and... The ground was coming up too fast. Cadence flapped her wings, but the wind seemed to beat her down from above. Her hooves struck the snow and the cobbled streets beneath, and her knees buckled, pitching her forward. She tried to flap again, but the motion was useless. She skidded headlong into a drift of snow in the shadow of a small greenhouse. Her cannons began to hurt, but she ignored them, throwing herself out of the snow and galloping down the street toward the station. She ran headlong at the door, throwing it open with her magic just before she reached it. And she found herself careening into a large, unutterably handsome white stallion. He caught her somehow. She thought she might have felt the tingle of his magic around her wings. She looked up at him and grinned. He started to speak.
How did you know?
Cadence!
The voice came from off to her left, utterly ruining her contemplation of Shining's beautiful eyes. She didn't care.
Twilight!
Cadence dashed over to her sister-in-law, throwing hooves around her in a hug.
How did you get here? They told me they'd cancelled the trains.
Twilight blushed and scuffed a hoof against the ground.
Well, we didn't exactly...
Come on, Twilight. You have to tell her.
Shining's laugh twinkled in Cadence's ears as he walked over.
It was brilliant. You should have seen the look on everypony's face when she suggested it.
Cadence frowned, and Twilight's blush deepened.
Well, I was visiting Luna last week, and I did some studying in the Star Swirl the Bearded Wing, and when they told us the train was delayed, and we were all just waiting around in the station, I had some time to think about how a couple of those old spells worked. You see, if you use Star Swirl's Chrono Displacement spell with Bradel Vine's looping algorithm for magical energies and Blue Moon's theory of exchangeability, you can make the...
Twilight!
We took next Tuesday's train instead. We just got here early. Everypony's going to have to take a couple extra rail trips next week to make up for it. But they all said they didn't mind.
So, your parents were able to come too?
Cadence asked. She'd gotten to spend Hearthswarming with them the last couple of years, and it had been nice. Nicer than she would have expected long ago. She had hoped they wouldn't mind coming to the Crystal Empire, especially if Shining and Twilight were already planning to be here.
Yes?
Twilight still sounded a little sheepish.
And maybe a few others?
There was a commotion from one of the walkways leading to the tracks, and a familiar white unicorn in a bright pink hat pushed into view, with a filly tagging along at her heels. 2 other fillies followed close behind, all talking to each other in excited voices. Then came a little purple dragon, carrying an enormous tower of luggage. Then Shining's parents, and behind them a family of earth ponies, only one of whom Cadence recognized. Then more ponies. Her eyes started to water. She turned to her husband. He shook his head, looking a bit rueful.
Nope, still Twilight. She was full of ideas today.
Cadence turned to her sister-in-law and found that her vision was starting to blur. She scrunched up her face, trying for a smile. Twilight spoke in a quiet voice.
I remembered a story you told me once, a long time ago. You were supposed to be reading to me in Smarty Pants, and you pretended pretty well. But I know what's in my books. It seemed like a pretty important story, though, so I remembered it.
My Clover the Clever.
Shining looked between the 2 of them, confusion painted on his face.
What are you 2 talking about? Twilight? Cadence?
The clock began to toll the hour. Midnight. Twilight stared up at it, puzzled.
That shouldn't have happened. We were supposed to arrive exactly at the beginning of the new day. That's the only way I could get the math to work out.
Shining said something in reply, but Cadence didn't hear it. She turned and stared out the windows of the train station. The Crystal Castle looked cold and dark, and far more welcoming than the palace in Canterlot had ever been. Nothing important ever happened on Hearthswarming, she'd told Cinnabar. No, that was wrong. 3 times now, Hearthswarming Eve was when she'd found her family. Cadence gave the train station a searching glance. There, behind Spike and the 3 little fillies, the grey mare with the cello was beginning to stir, awakened by the commotion around her. Cadence felt a stab of sadness watching her. The mare had spent all Hearthswarming Eve alone in the cold of the train station. Cadence could have fixed that if she hadn't been too preoccupied with her own problems to think of it. No one deserved to be alone on Hearthswarming Eve. Shining brushed his muzzle against her neck.
Well, Love Muffin, should we head back to the castle?
Cadence smiled and shook her head.
Not yet, Shiny. I think there's something I need to do first.
She gave him a quick kiss, turned, and trotted toward the grey mare.